Marilyn Monroe died 51 years ago today. Historians have long written about the possibility.
Most famous stars in Hollywood history is dead at 36.
For decades, the death of Marilyn Monroe has captivated the world as one of the most enduring mysteries in Hollywood history. The icon, a dazzling blend of vulnerability and allure, was found dead in her Los Angeles home on the night of August 4, 1962. Officially ruled a probable suicide by overdose, her death instantly triggered waves of speculation and conspiracy. Countless books, documentaries, and investigative reports have re-examined the events leading up to her final hours, suggesting everything from accidental overdose to CIA involvement, from mafia entanglements to political assassination. But now, with newly declassified files and unprecedented access to private testimonies, the truth has finally emerged, and it's far more shocking than anyone imagined. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The revelation began with a sealed set of surveillance tapes recorded covertly in Monroe's home just days before her death. These tapes, long hidden within a trove of government evidence related to Cold War-era intelligence operations, surfaced during a routine archival audit by a team of federal historians. Initially dismissed as irrelevant, closer examination revealed a chilling web of conversations, coded language, and frantic encounters that pointed to a hidden chapter of Monroe's life that had never been fully explored. At the heart of this rediscovery was a calculated, deliberate orchestration. Monroe's death was neither a suicide nor an accident. It was a silencing. At the core of this revelation was Monroe's deepening entanglement with some of the most powerful men in America. Her well-documented relationships with President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, have long been the subject of speculation. But the tapes reveal that her involvement wasn't limited to romantic or social circles. Monroe had, either through intimacy or naive trust, become privy to highly sensitive information. She was a conduit, inadvertently exposed to the undercurrents of Cold War politics, military secrets, and covert operations that extended far beyond Hollywood's glittering boundaries. In one recording, Monroe can be heard speaking cryptically but clearly about secret meetings, phone calls from the East, and the files they don't want anyone to see. While she doesn't mention names explicitly, the voices of two men in the background, identified by voice recognition analysts as high-level intelligence officials, respond with growing unease. They caution her against asking questions and warn her that some truths don't belong in diaries. Monroe's growing desire to tell her story, to reclaim her narrative through a planned memoir, appears to have been the final spark that ignited a desperate and dangerous cover-up. For years, the notion of Monroe writing a tell-all had been considered little more than a rumor, fueled by her visits with journalists and cryptic notes in her personal journals. But among the cache of declassified documents was a draft outline of Monroe's intended memoir, recovered from a secure location where it had been hidden for over 60 years. The outline didn't just detail her rise to fame and battles with the studio system, it included references to political affairs, discussions she overheard about military movements, and names of individuals later linked to covert government operations. The stakes weren't just reputational, they were national. This sudden awareness placed Monroe in an extraordinarily dangerous position. She had crossed an invisible line from starlet to security threat. Surveillance was intensified, her phone lines tapped, her house swept regularly for documents and tapes. The pressure mounted, friends noticed changes, heightened paranoia, intense bouts of anxiety, erratic behavior that was long attributed to emotional instability, now reframed as symptoms of external manipulation and coercion. She was, as the tapes confirm, being gaslit and monitored by people she once trusted. The night of her death, according to newly verified time logs and call records, there was more activity at Monroe's home than ever previously acknowledged. Multiple unmarked vehicles arrived and departed within a span of 5 hours. Several individuals whose names appeared in intelligence community rosters made phone calls from nearby payphones, all traced to within a half-mile radius of her Brentwood residence. A private medical team, never officially recorded in any police report, entered the premises at 10:45 p.m. and left less than an hour later. By the time Monroe's housekeeper called for help around 3:30 a.m., everything had been sanitized. No signs of struggle, no physical evidence of force, Just a tidy arrangement of pills and an actress lying peacefully, too peacefully, on her bed. What happened between 10:45 p.m. and the early hours of the morning was a meticulously executed operation. Not a messy hit job or a botched cover-up, but a clinical silencing designed to look like self-destruction. Experts in psychological operations had long known how to frame a scene for maximum believability. Monroe's past struggles with mental health, her substance use, and her perceived fragility all worked in the orchestrator's favor. The tragedy would seem plausible, expected even. Her death would be mourned, speculated over, and eventually mythologized. But the truth would remain buried under layers of national security and celebrity gossip. The forensic reevaluation of Monroe's autopsy also played a key role in cracking the mystery. Modern toxicology, aided by preserved samples from the original investigation, identified inconsistencies in the dosage levels and administration methods. There was no evidence of pill residue in her stomach, a puzzling detail that had been noted even at the time but never thoroughly pursued. Experts now confirm that the fatal dose was likely administered via enema or injection, pointing again to professional intervention rather than accidental overdose or suicide. Adding further weight to the revelation were the testimonies of two aging intelligence operatives who, facing terminal illness and burdened by decades of secrecy, came forward to confirm the orchestration of Monroe's death. Their accounts, though separate, aligned in uncanny precision. Both spoke of the operation as a national imperative, a preemptive measure taken to avoid catastrophic leaks that could have compromised global alliances. Their statements painted Monroe not as a manipulative figure leveraging secrets for personal gain, but as a woman caught in a geopolitical riptide she neither invited nor understood. The implications of this discovery are as profound as they are disturbing. Monroe was not merely a casualty of fame or mental illness. She was a victim of a system that deemed her expendable. Her life, so publicly celebrated, was privately erased by the very institutions sworn to protect freedom and justice. In a cruel twist, the voice that captivated millions was silenced not by the pressures of stardom, but by the cold logic of national interest. What makes the revelation even more compelling is how it reframes Monroe's entire career. Once dismissed by critics as little more than a pretty face, a blonde bombshell with limited range, Monroe was in truth an astute observer of her surroundings. Her journal entries, once interpreted as emotional ramblings, now read like coded reflections of a woman walking a tightrope between two worlds. Hollywood's fantasy and Washington's secrets converged in her life with breathtaking tension. Monroe's final days were not a slow spiral but a crescendo of confrontation. She had decided to step out of her controlled narrative, to share her truth in her own words. This decision, noble and brave, proved fatal. The machinery of power could not tolerate such a breach, not from a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to tell. The very institutions that celebrated her beauty turned on her brilliance. She wasn't supposed to be listening. She certainly wasn't supposed to be remembering. As this truth comes to light, questions echo louder than ever. How many others were silenced in similar ways? What mechanism still exists to erase those who stumble too close to dangerous knowledge? And most hauntingly, how many secrets still sleep in classified vaults waiting for history to catch up? The Marilyn Monroe mystery, long shrouded in conjecture, has finally found its resolution. But it is not the comforting closure of a riddle solved. It is a reckoning, a glimpse behind the velvet curtain at a truth so brutal it was buried for over 6 decades. Monroe's legacy, once filtered through tabloid sensationalism and romantic tragedy, now carries a different weight, a grim acknowledgement of what happens when innocence collides with empire. This revelation also forces a re-evaluation of the era itself. The 1960s, long revered as a time of cultural revolution and transformation, had undercurrents far darker than peace marches and flower power. Monroe's death becomes a pivot point in that historical narrative, a moment where the glitter of celebrity intersected fatally with the clandestine world of intelligence. The decade's heroes and villains are no longer so easily defined. The stage was larger, the stakes far higher than anyone wanted to admit. Even more unsettling is the recognition of how easily perception was manipulated. For decades, the world believed a lie not because it was convincing, but because it was convenient. The narrative of the troubled actress, undone by her own demons, suited everyone. from studio executives eager to preserve brand value to officials desperate to avoid scandal. The truth was known, buried, and strategically forgotten. Now, it demands to be acknowledged. Monroe's final tragedy was not the loneliness of her last night, but the deliberate stripping of her agency. In the most literal sense, her voice was taken from her. But the deliberate stripping of her agency. In the most literal sense, her voice was taken from her. Not just in life, but in history. The world mourned her for the wrong reasons, celebrated her for the surface, and ignored the substance she was only beginning to reveal. Her attempt to reclaim control was rebranded as a breakdown. Her demand to be heard became evidence of instability. It was a masterclass in narrative control, executed with chilling efficiency. With this mystery finally unraveled, the question remains, what will change? Will history recalibrate its understanding of Monroe's role in the political landscape of her time? Will her name shift from symbol to statement? From Hollywood tragedy to national martyr? Only time will tell. But what is clear, now more than ever, is that Monroe's life was far more complex, her death far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. This is not just a solved mystery, it's a cautionary tale, one about power, perception, and the cost of proximity to truth. Marilyn Monroe was not destroyed by fame or fragility, but by a system that feared what she had become, aware, awake, and unwilling to remain silent. Her death was not the end of a glamorous career, but the erasure of a threat to the shadows that shape nations. And yet, in the revelation of this truth, her voice rises again, not through whispers or innuendo, but through undeniable evidence and brave confessions that refuse to remain buried. The story she never got to tell is now out in the open, and it is as shocking as it is tragic. Monroe, in death, finally breaks the silence, and the world can no longer look away. With the truth about Marilyn Monroe's death now exposed, the implications extend well beyond the boundaries of one woman's tragic end. What emerges is not just a revelation about Monroe, but a window into the depth of institutional manipulation and the limits of personal freedom in the face of state power. For years, the line between celebrity culture and national security was assumed to be uncrossable, yet Monroe's life proves that those lines were more porous than anyone could have imagined. Her death wasn't just a cover-up, it was a keystone event in the silent war between secrecy and the public's right to know. One of the most disturbing realizations from the newly uncovered evidence is how deliberately the public was misled. Every stage of the investigation, from the arrival of the first responders to the statements made to the press, was scripted, rehearsed, and executed with precision. Investigators were carefully selected, reports were sanitized, and forensic findings were adjusted to support the official story. Photographs were withheld or destroyed. Witnesses were either ignored or discredited. Even the media, knowingly or not, became complicit in a story crafted not to inform but to misdirect. At the time, the cultural landscape was far more susceptible to narrative control. There was no internet, no social media, no independent citizen journalism. A handful of powerful institutions, government, media outlets, film studios, essentially dictated public perception. If they presented Monroe as a broken woman who overdosed alone in a room, the story would stick, and it did for more than 60 years. What's now undeniable is that the entire Monroe tragedy was not just covered up, it was engineered, and its success speaks volumes about the effectiveness of information suppression in the 20th century. The freshly revealed materials also cast a dark shadow on the roles played by some of Monroe's closest associates. Her psychiatrist, publicist, and even her housekeeper, figures who were supposed to protect her well-being, appear to have been either compromised or manipulated. Transcripts from interviews conducted in the aftermath of her death were cross-referenced with surveillance records and were found to contain glaring inconsistencies. Timelines didn't match. Descriptions of Monroe's mood, behaviors, and conversations were recited almost verbatim across multiple individuals, suggesting rehearsed testimonies rather than genuine recollections. In hindsight, the consistency was less about truth and more about cohesion, a narrative agreed upon in advance. What makes Monroe's situation especially chilling is how vulnerable she was to this sort of betrayal. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she didn't have a strong family network or long-standing allies in her personal circle. Her meteoric rise to fame isolated her. She became dependent on a rotating cast of assistants, therapists, handlers, and lovers, many of whom were ultimately more loyal to their own careers or secret allegiances than to her. This isolation made her easier to surveil, easier to manipulate, and tragically, easier to eliminate without immediate suspicion. Another overlooked aspect that now demands attention is Monroe's increasing engagement with global political issues. In the months before her death, she had begun to connect with intellectuals, activists, and foreign artists. Records show that she was in communication with several individuals who were under FBI surveillance for their leftist ideologies. While Monroe herself was never politically radical, her curiosity and empathy led her into conversations that raised red flags within intelligence circles. She asked questions others avoided. She sought understanding in a world divided by ideology and war. This natural inclination to explore ideas beyond her scripted persona was seen not as intellectual growth, but as dangerous unpredictability. Monroe's proximity to secrets was no longer accidental, it was becoming intentional. She had begun to recognize her power, not just as a figure of desire, but as a cultural voice. That transformation, subtle yet evident in her later interviews and personal writings, was perhaps the most threatening change of all. A woman like Monroe, armed not just with beauty and fame, but with knowledge and intent, was the exact kind of unpredictable element that intelligence agencies sought to neutralize. A particularly damning detail emerged from documents outlining internal communications between government agencies. Monroe's name was flagged multiple times under various intelligence protocols, often with notations that framed her as a security risk rather than a citizen. What began as monitoring due to her romantic ties to prominent political figures quickly evolved into something more strategic. Agencies debated her reliability, her mental stability, and most crucially, her silence. The calculus was cold. If there was even a chance she might go public, the risk was too great. In Monroe's case, the mechanics of silencing weren't limited to the act itself, but extended to the lasting control of her legacy. Over the years, her image was systematically molded into a symbol of fragility, heartbreak, and eroticism. These were not just the byproducts of public mourning, but deliberate reinforcements of a controlled narrative. Films, photo retrospectives, and even museum exhibits highlighted the tragic, the glamorous, and the broken, but never the subversive, the perceptive, or the politically aware. She was preserved as a myth, carefully curated to distract from the real reasons behind her demise. The new information also prompts a re-examination of the broader context in which Monroe lived and died. The early 1960s were a crucible of tension. Nuclear standoffs, civil rights struggles, and a growing distrust between citizens and their government. Monroe's death, seen through this lens, becomes more than a celebrity tragedy. It becomes a cultural checkpoint. Her silencing symbolized a moment where personal truth clashed with state power, where transparency was deemed a threat, and where even someone as visible as Monroe could be made invisible if the stakes demanded it. Understanding the extent of the conspiracy also raises sobering questions about the ethics of intelligence operations and the boundaries of government power. If a beloved actress could be targeted and eliminated for what she might reveal, what protections exist for ordinary citizens? Where is the line between national security and authoritarian overreach? The Monroe case forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that the pursuit of security has, at times, justified actions incompatible with the very freedoms it claims to defend. The technical sophistication of the operation also reveals how advanced psychological and logistical strategies had become even at that time. The orchestration involved psychological profiling, manipulation of medical professionals, media control, and logistical planning down to the minute. This wasn't a rogue hit. It was a coordinated initiative, likely sanctioned at levels of power that remain, even now, untraceable. Such coordination requires not only approval but infrastructure. It was not a momentary lapse in ethics, it was an embedded capability within the system. As Monroe's story is reframed in the wake of these discoveries, the broader implications stretch into the present. Her case becomes a template, a cautionary tale for how easily the truth can be reshaped, obscured, and eventually forgotten if power goes unchecked. It raises the uncomfortable possibility that similar tactics may still be in use today, under different circumstances and with different faces. The silence imposed on Monroe is a silence that has echoed across generations, disguising itself as mystery, rumor, or lore. But now that it's broken, it challenges everything we thought we knew about the intersection of fame, politics, and control. There's also a profound emotional dimension to the truth. Understanding the calculated nature of Monroe's death rehumanizes her in a way that decades of idolization never could. She wasn't just a victim of her own flaws. She was a woman trying to evolve beyond the role she had been given. Her courage in pursuing truth about herself, her relationships, and the world around her ultimately led to her destruction. That courage, overlooked for so long, now becomes the defining attribute of her legacy. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Marilyn Monroe's mystery finally being solved? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.